Thank you guys very much for joining this Checkpoint 360 Leadership Feedback System information session. This is exactly what I'm here to do, is give you 30 minutes packed full of information. And I have a lot to cover, so I'll roll through it. You can either hold your questions till the end or pop them into the chat box. My wonderful assistant, Smila, is going to be monitoring it. But I will go ahead and get started. And by the way, this session is designed for leaders who are curious about 360 tools or exploring different 360 tools. And I'm here just to show them one of the tools that I use with my clients quite successfully. And this session came to be as a follow-up to our leadership development and executive coaching webinar that we conducted a few weeks back. For those of you who are unfamiliar with me and Great People Management, I'm Tatiana St. Germain, founder and CEO of Great People Management. We celebrated 10 years this month. Woohoo! We're talent assessment experts and leadership development and team development and communication company. We provide assessments for selection, onboarding, engagement, retention, and of course, the topic of our conversation today, leadership development. And I do a lot of executive coaching. Leadership development is a very, very hot topic right now. As our polls showed, number one concern is retention of high potential leaders. 52% of people who quit, including leaders, say that their company could have done something to prevent their exit. And more often than not, people leave when they stop learning, especially leaders. So you've got to give them opportunities to grow, identify gaps, identify opportunities for them. By the way, Smila, could you mute all participants just for the background noise? Thank you. So yeah, that's where 360 comes into play. And why do we need it? Well, we don't know what we don't know. Everybody needs feedback and perspective, whether you're at the top or on the way to the top. It can be lonely, and we all need to be forced almost to make the space and time to work on ourselves, on our business. And 360 is a great starting point for that. As I said, you don't know what you don't know. Everything's a matter of perception and perspective. Sometimes leaders assume too many things about their surroundings, and other times leaders assume many things about their own capabilities and abilities. So they need to have that feedback. I often get asked, well, with respect to these two mindsets, growth mindset versus fixed mindset, get a lot of questions about that. Wonderful book by Carol Dweck, highly recommend. But in the context of leadership development and particularly 360 feedback, which of the mindset is more receptive? Well, naturally, growth mindset people are more receptive, but fixed mindset leaders can benefit from a 360 as well, because here's what's happening here. Growth mindset people want to learn, and fixed mindset people need to know. And that's what I'm finding. It's what you do on the backside of the 360 that's a little different. Growth mindset people take the feedback and off they go. Fixed mindset people often are blindsided by the feedback and they have to kind of process it, and they need some executive coaching help on the backside of the 360 to help them develop new habits, transform their behavior, and dismantle some of the bad habits. And again, if there are other questions, we can definitely have a conversation. You can pop your questions in the chat. So what is a typical 360? And by the way, this let's call this leader George here, so we have a little face and a name, so I don't constantly just say leader. So George wants to have a 360 done, and sometimes I actually get leaders, executive leaders, reach out to me directly, to Great People Management directly, asking for tools to give them feedback because their company is not providing them with any feedback. Talk about growth mindset. And then in other situations, we have entire leadership teams going through 360s with the intent to provide leaders with feedback on how they see themselves, how their bosses see them as a leader. So like George would evaluate himself, then George's boss would evaluate him, and we can have up to 3 bosses. And then we have 3 groups of respondents. In other 360 systems, you may have only 2 groups, but the point here is the same. We're trying to collect feedback from a variety of people who are observing George in his leadership as a leader. The feedback from direct reports, peers, and a group of others is anonymous and confidential. A group of others, you might ask, who are these people? Well, they are internal customers. Sometimes they are some folks that George would work with on a kind of cross-functional basis. So it all depends on the organizational structure. For myself, when I do 360 on myself, I actually include my clients. So it could be internal or external customers, vendors, whoever you interact with and would like to have feedback on how you show up as a person. We all have blind spots. You can include into these groups. This is something that I covered in more detail during our leadership development webinar, but I'll just do a quick recap. What does collecting this feedback allow us to accomplish? It helps us not only align core competency, but organizational priorities. Now we have the language on paper tells us what is mission critical in George's leadership position and how that might impact the processes organization-wide we need to change or improve. Clarify expectations, have deeper, better conversations. Again, we're all ships in our own bottles. So we tell ourselves, just because I show up frowning to my people, they better know that I'm not happy with their performance. Well, then you get the feedback from the 360 and it turns out they have no idea how you're feeling about their performance. So clarify expectations. These are some of the opportunities we identify, development opportunities, gaps, always room for improvement. But on our 360, we also identify and celebrate strengths, because there's some things that come naturally to you, intuitively, you're doing them well, you don't even know what those things are. It's important to identify them, write them down, and start doing them on purpose. Self-awareness, well, without self-awareness, we all have blind spots, and without self-awareness, we cannot build new habits. We cannot dismantle bad habits either. Improve communication, accountability, and trust, because what I recommend all leaders who go through 360 at the end, they find a comfortable path. Maybe it's staff meetings, one-on-one meetings. You need to thank people for their feedback and share as much or as little that you want about the things that you uncovered about yourself and the type of things that you're working on. Because next time a 360 rolls around, they will be more willing to provide you with constructive feedback, and you will know how you show up, how effective you are. Keeping in mind that not all 360 tools are created equal. I often deal with 360 PTSD where 360s were implemented poorly, or a poor 360 tool was selected and didn't really produce the desired effect, the desired results. Perhaps there was an issue with anonymity or confidentiality, or the purpose was not clear. For example, they were using it as a way to deboard or get rid of somebody. Please don't use 360s as part of your performance improvement plan. This is a development tool only. What kind of questions are asked? Are they like-based? Is it popularity contest or task-based? What kind of feedback, time to complete? So you know all the logistics, all the things that you have to take into account. What are comments available? Bias? Is there a validation process? How do you track progress? How do you make the feedback and development stick? Lasting behavioral transformation. All of those things I actually included in a 360 assessment scorecard. So as you're looking at different 360s, we will send out after the session this assessment scorecard, and you can map your 360 against Checkpoint 360 that I'm about to share with you. But these are all the things you want to keep in mind as you're selecting one. So back to our Checkpoint 360 for leadership. How is it different? It is designed for professional development. The questions are task-based. It is strengths-focused. It takes 15 minutes to complete, measures 18 skill sets and 8 critical leadership competencies. We ensure complete confidentiality. No one knows who said what, with the exception of self. Obviously, that's one person, and boss, that's one person. Feedback is anonymous for the groups, generates a custom individual development plan, which is important for many organizations. If they need to have a development plan on file, you have it baked in. So that's value add. It's not an event, but a process. We have a way to do comparative checkpoint 360s. There is a technical manual available. Everything's done online. You can have up to 40 participants that include self and bosses. We have fairness flags, which I will describe. It's when you have people in some of your group of respondents, some like you, some dislike you. So how does it impact feedback? We can address that. It allows comments. There is no opportunity to observe option for each of the sections. There's a competency alignment section. That's when we discuss that core competency alignment for the organization and for the leader. We have the opportunity to correlate perceptions with reality. I will talk at the end. Hopefully I have time to mention the PXT assessment as well. Executive summary is presented to the president or CEO if the leadership team, the entire leadership management team participated in the 360, and it might be difficult for the boss to go through each one of the 360s. They still have access to that. But executive summary gives them, kind of highlights the most important pieces of information to focus on. There is feedback for the leader and for the boss, and of course, professional debriefs we provide help you make sense and get the best out of the information. As promised, this is what we measure on our 360: communication, leadership, adaptability, relationships, task management, production, development of others, and personal development. So leaders are asked, and their respondents are asked questions around these competencies and skill sets. The total number of questions, by the way, is 70. The rating scale in our case is from 1 to 5, with, again, opportunity to say NA if there was no opportunity to observe a particular behavior. So it's based on frequency of observed behavior. This is what I call your respondent's truth, not your truth necessarily. It's how you show up, how you are perceived. And they can rate you from almost never, seldom, sometimes, usually, almost always. Available reports with our Checkpoint 360, we have individual feedback report with that individual development plan included. Management report has coaching and management considerations to help the boss support the development of the leader. Comparison report and management comparison report is when we conduct 360s back to back with about 12 to 18 months apart, and the executive overview report. Next, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to run through screenshots from the actual sample report and what it looks like. The entire structure of the report is sort of like zooming in. We keep zooming in as we go through the report, starting with bird's eye view, where we look at all 8 universal competencies and check how the leader, self, so in this case, let's go back to George. Self as George is rating himself. How does he see himself compared to how he is seen by others? I sometimes refer to this section as a delusion check. And the biggest delusion gap we have is in development of others. In this case, George is rating himself very highly, above the favorable zone. In fact, compared to all observers, they do not see him that way at all. So this is clearly his blind spot. In most cases, I do not see many gaps, and most leaders actually are fairly self-aware. And there's just a couple of areas where there is a significant differential between self-perception and perception of others. But in this case, we do have a big one. So perhaps that's one thing that we want to focus on as we continue to zoom in. One thing I always tell leaders who go through this process is there's so much feedback, as you saw, 8 universal competencies, 18 skill sets. There's a ton of information to cover. You cannot be everything to everyone, and you cannot possibly cover or focus on every single thing. So the first question is, what is mission critical? as you kind of skim through all of this feedback, as you see some of the first gaps that are identified, what is mission critical? And the only person who can answer that is George in our case, or during the conversation with George's boss. The next section is the skill set summary overview. So these are all 18 skill sets that we measure, rated from highest to lowest. And by the way, the favorable zone is 3.5 to 4.25. The reason it's this way is because during our review or validation studies around the world with leaders worldwide, different industries, different levels of leadership, different companies, different cultures. What we find time and time again is that leaders are most effective when they're balanced, and they find that balance within the favorable zone. This means that you're not so focused overcompensating in one area that it takes away your focus in other areas. In fact, I would rather see you be in the favorable zone, hovering between 3.5 and 4.25 on everything, than what we see here, overcompensating in achieving results, working competently, and displaying commitment, and then seeing some issues with providing direction and delegating responsibility. This is much too great of a gap to be effective and balanced. The next section is critical skills alignment summary. This is the one that helps the boss and George get together and talk about what is mission critical for the position that George is in and how that impacts the organization overall. And then we start to zoom in and look at the feedback from different groups. I'm not going to go through this in detail. First, we look at the 8 competencies and feedback from different groups. On the right side, I understand this might be a little too small for you to read, but I promise you it's there. Oops, wrong way. And then we start to zoom in even further and look at feedback from all the groups on competencies and the skill sets that make up competencies. In this case, we have communication. Communication is made up by a skill set, listening to others, processing information, and communicating effectively. And then the final section of the report provides feedback on all 70 items, 70 questions that were asked on the assessment. Fairness flags I mentioned, you can see on number 3, listening to all points of view with an open mind. We have a D flag. This indicates that within the group of direct reports, there was lack of consensus when it comes to this item. This means that response is varied by 3 or more points. And when you're on a scale from 1 to 5, this is huge. And when we talk about consistency, meaning quality and effectiveness, what you do for one, you do for everyone else. So if something happened, there's a breakdown of consistency on that number 3. Using that as just as an example. Finally, the development summary overview, taking into account everything that we just reviewed, including comments. I did not show you the section with comments, but it would be preceding this development summary overview. The system then is going to recommend 3 areas of focus. The first one is going to be the lowest score. The next one is the next lowest score that boss himself identified as critical to focus on for organizational success. And then the next area of focus that was again identified by boss himself as critical. This is how George ended up with achieving result, facilitating team success, and delegating responsibility as 3 areas of focus. Next section of the report is going to dig into the actual items that George might want to select to do to improve his performance in these 3 areas. And first, the report will explain the KSS method that we use. What are the things that you are doing very, very well, and you need to keep doing them on purpose, write them down. What are some of the things that creep into your routine when you're tired or upset, and stop doing them, write them down. And these are really real actionable things, not pie in the sky kind of conceptual things. And then the actions, maybe you had some aha moments throughout the process. what do you need to start doing? And again, these are actions, these are not ideas. So it would be, for example, I worked with somebody who was saying thank you a lot. Just throughout our debrief, he said thank you probably 100 times. So one of the first things for him was write down, stop saying thank you. And the start doing was start expressing gratitude in a different way other than thank you, so that it doesn't lose its meaning, because he was coming across to his team as unauthentic, as we discovered through his feedback. So things that are very, very specific, and again, mission critical. Not everything is going to be mission critical. The rest of the development guide is going to provide the area of focus, skills, behaviors, attitudes to adapt and practice, challenging activities. And then on the coaching side, the coaching and management considerations for the management report for the boss will include the accountability process that the boss can use to support the development. And in the remaining couple of minutes, I would like to share with you the perception and reality piece, where we combine what we found, what we gathered in terms of feedback on the Checkpoint 360. As you know, any 360 is a perception-based tool. That's their truth. That's how you show up. What is your reality? That's the PXT Select assessment. Why do we need a PXT Select assessment? And I'll explain what that is. But before we do, why do we need to connect the perception and the reality? It's because we need to know, or I need to know as a coach, when I work with the leader, are we changing the perception, or do we need to change the habit? So if it's just a matter of perception, for example, the George in our case is lacking visibility. He's not sharing enough information, or he's not consistent when it comes to listening to others. Well, then he just needs to work on the perception. But if we find that when it comes to his pace, yes, he's kind of chasing shiny objects. He has a great sense of urgency. He moves through tasks very fast. He's also very assertive and reserved on sociability. Well, now I'm saying, based on George's reality, that perception is based in reality, in the truth. So we actually need to work on strategies to change that habit. We're not going to change George, but we will change the habit. So PXT helps us understand what lies hidden below the water surface from self and others, oftentimes, that shows up later. That's their potential core behavioral tendencies and motivation. Through day-to-day interactions, we only observe 10% of the person. So PXT measures 20 traits, but what's especially impactful to leadership DNA and that leadership reality of who the person is, how they show up, is particularly these 9 behavioral traits. And so we look at the behavioral traits, where they score. I even have a mapping document that helps connect who you are as a leader, your personal, unique leadership approach, and how that plays out in behavior, as we discover with the 360 feedback. It's a very powerful experience. So some of the deliverables you can expect when you combine the 360 and the PXT and get total feedback for the leader, self-awareness and feedback, awareness of how they show up, is the 360 report, PXT leadership report, their leadership approach. What we provide is a group debrief, talking about a report structure and how to prepare for one-on-one debriefs and next steps. Then it's followed up by a one-on-one debrief, where we review individual feedback and the PXT scores and connect the dots, so to speak. Finalize individual development plan with actions, action items. They have to be, once again, I cannot say enough, actionable, mission critical, and implementable. This is the stuff that doesn't just look pretty on paper, some ethereal notions, and look pretty on paper, and you put them in your desk. Here's my development plan. Never sees the light of the day. They have to be mission critical and actionable, and actually simple enough to implement that you want to do them. Opportunity to engage in further executive coaching. Again, it just depends on leader self-awareness and needs. And the boss will receive the management report for each leader, PXT team report, and leadership team summary of the 360 feedback. So this is our typical process and our 360. And let's open up for questions.